People who have found a dead body, what's the story? Story 1. I was 21. I woke up around 9:30 or 10. I peeked in my mom's room to say good morning. Her TV was on, but she wasn't there. She liked to use the bathroom in the master bedroom if it was available. More privacy, I guess. And the door to the master was cracked, so I figured, oh, she's in the bathroom. Let me take the dogs outside to do their thing. Well, about 10 minutes later, I come back inside and she's still not in her room, so I go peek inside the master to see if she's feeling okay. It's dark and I see her asleep on a recliner. So I call out Mom a few times quietly and then go to nudge her knee and she is ice. Fucking cold. I finally look up at her face and realize she's dead, and has been for a while, maybe a few hours. Mouth hanging open, staring into the nothing. She's completely pale and her lips were blue. It was the most traumatic thing I have ever experienced, and it has really fucked me up. That woman was my absolute best friend in the entire world. They said she had a heart attack. Story 2. I came home to a dark house around 9 p.m. Told myself she's just at a play with her friends. Went to bed and all night long I couldn't sleep. Then at 5 a.m. got my shit together and went to check on her upstairs. She had collapsed in her bedroom sometime the previous day from a stroke. Looking back, I knew she had died when I came home. There were so many things wrong. I always called the landline on my way home but kept getting a busy signal. The dog was acting anxious and wouldn't settle down. There wasn't any lights on, even the porch light. It was all in front of me, but my brain just couldn't accept it. It was too big, too awful, and my mind kept denying and making excuses. When I found her, my entire life came crashing down on me. The only comfort you and I have is that our moms died quickly and peacefully. They left us behind, but their suffering is over. I like to think that they will wait for us. Story 3. My freshman year of college, right during winter finals, my closest college friend who liked to prank me was in his bed, ignoring his alarm. His roommate came to get me to wake him up. It was a lofted bed. I figured it was a setup. I climbed up there and immediately knew something was horribly wrong and yelled for someone to call for help. His face is still burned into my mind over 20 years later. I would describe it as scared, with his eyes wide open and his mouth agape as if he were gasping or trying to scream. His hands gripped his sheets tightly. An hour plus of attempts to revive him in the dorm hallway failed. We found out later that he grew up with heart-related issues, and his aorta tore in his sleep before his 19th birthday. Before we leaned the cause, I barely slept for weeks. I was terrified whatever got him was getting me next because we spent so much time together. All these years later, and I'm still in loose contact with his family. Story 4. My wife died suddenly in the shower 3 years ago. No scream, just collapsed. I thought she had dropped a bottle of shampoo, but when I went to check on her DEAD, tried doing chest compressions with EMS on the phone, didn't work. I was beside myself with grief and guilt for 3 days, until the autopsy revealed a tear in her aorta. There was nothing I could have done to save her. I am still traumatized by the suddenness, the unfairness of it all. The fact we didn't even get a minute to say goodbye and she's just gone. I want to thank the community at Our Widowers which supplied me, and many others in the same situation with grief counseling. Story 5. I was with my friend when her husband called in a panic because he'd peed himself and had awful chest pains. He was driving his work van and managed to pull over before collapsing. We raced to him, but nothing could be done. He died in the middle of a busy road after 45 minutes of CPR. We initially thought it was a heart attack and wondered why he didn't survive when you hear of so many people surviving, but post-mortem revealed a thoracic aortic dissection. Almost always deadly with no treatment unless you're in theater at the time of the dissection. I will never ever forget the fear in his voice and the devastation in my friend's face when we were notified they couldn't save him. They'd been together for 35 years. The weirdest thing is that he was absolutely convinced he'd die at 56 because his dad died of a heart attack at that age. He'd just turned 56 3 months prior to his death. Story 6. On my way to work at 3:30 in the morning, I was carpooling with 2 other guys. We were going through Wolcott, Connecticut. Anyone that knows that area knows there's a lot of woods. Anyway, I noticed brake lights that were illuminated behind some trees, so I pulled over to check it out. It was this red SUV blasting reggaeton. The driver had his head slumped down like he was sleeping. I noticed about 20 open beers in the back seat, so we thought he was just drunk. We started to knock on the door to wake him up while we waited for the cops to show up. About 5 minutes later, a cop car pulls up. Officer goes to the driver's side and turns on his flashlight. The second it turned on, we immediately saw the bullet holes on the side of the driver's side door. In like less than a minute, there was at least 10 cop cars shutting everything down. Story 7. I was lucky enough to not have to find my father or stepfather when they took their own lives, but I had to help police navigate to the spot my stepdad did it. I did, however, find my grandmother when she passed. We were really close most of my life, and I had moved in with her while I was sobering up and going through a divorce. She had started progressing in her dementia, and honestly taking care of her was exactly what I needed at that moment. I don't know if I could have done it for anyone else, but it was kind of cathartic that I was helping feed the woman who taught me how to use a fork. She was pleasant most of the time, but she'd get scared when she was confused and didn't know what was going on. So I'd just have her snuggle up on my shoulder and tell her stories about us in a calm voice until she felt better, remembering how many times she'd done that for me. I'd gotten an opportunity to move and do some dream work in my dream city, so my mother was going to take over caring for her when I moved. I was all packed, had the car loaded and everything when I went to wake her to say goodbye. She was laying on the floor beside the bed. I called out her name and no response. I rushed over to see if I needed to do CPR, and when I laid my hand on her arm, she was cold to the touch. I literally Googled what to do when you find grandma dead. Then called the non-emergency line. The police and EMT came to pronounce her, and the coroner's office stopped by. Then the funeral home came to get her. My grandma had given me one last gift on her way out, a chance to finally grieve a natural death after a life very well lived, and the peace of knowing I wasn't leaving her behind. Story 8. Was out driving one night in college with my ex. We used to just go on long drives together to talk about stuff and get away from the university. We were maybe 45 minutes into the country under a pitch-black sky filled with stars, and came over a hill to see two red taillights off in a field. It was so dark that was all we could see until we got closer and saw it was a car crashed directly into a willow tree, and the driver was all mangled and dead in the driver's seat, partially out the windshield. We called the cops, but since it was in the middle of nowhere, it took a bit to get service and then a bit longer for them to get out to us. Saddest thing about it was that the driver was a teenager. Story 9. My best friend hung himself from the monkey bars in his backyard with a dog leash. I found him hanging there and tried to save him by holding his legs and lifting him up. Vomit all over me and that smell. Fuck. I moved to a different state years later, and in high school I had a teacher who was talking about how one of his students in state I came from died via dog leash hanging. Turned out to be the same kid. My then teacher was the principal of the school my friend attended, and my friend was always in trouble in the principal's office, so they knew each other well. A few years after I graduated, the teacher was arrested for charges of statutory sex offense and taking indecent liberties with a child. A fucking 3-year-old. I still think he had something to do with my friend's suicide. Story 10. This is the classic domestic violence story of man kills woman, because if I can't have her, nobody else will story. Nat 14. I woke to find my mother with a shotgun hole in her chest under the kitchen table and her murderer outside under the clothesline with his brains blown out. The only difference between this and other stories like this is I am the kid who wasn't murdered with her mother. Story 11. Was driving at 11 p.m. to a Waffle House for some damn fine chicken and waffles. I'm about 900 feet driving 80 to the exit off-ramp when a car flies by me, doing what seemed like at least 100 mph plus. I watched him not slow down enough for the turn. Then he started going off the road to the left, overcorrect, then lose control of his car, and drive into a guardrail full speed. I'm obviously first one to the crash. Dust still hadn't settled from the impact. The car was low enough that the front hood had gone under the rail and was wedged in between it and the road. As the driver wasn't wearing his seatbelt, groan, his lifeless body was smashed between the steering wheel, dashboard, and the roof of his car. Dude was smushed like a grape. I used my car to block the scene so first responders could arrive. There was nothing to do except unwedge his car and collect him. He was pronounced dead on the scene. I watched the news the next night make a small mention of his death, but that was it. Never got his name. The chicken and waffles had no flavor, and I didn't sleep that night at all. Story 12. I went to bring in the mail after a 2-week vacation and noticed my neighbor's box was just as full as mine. Bobby was an older man, drunk, fat, poor, and borderline disabled, and most days I'd bring his mail in for him so he didn't have to get in his car to drive to the box. I grabbed his mail and brought it in his house. Noticed immediately it was just as cold inside as outside. Mid-January. I opened the basement door and heard the TV and went to his man cave. His couch faced the TV and the back of the couch faced the stairs, so I couldn't see his face right away. I called for him and then made the mistake of putting my hand on his shoulder to get his attention. Bob was very, very dead. So dead he didn't seem to have eyes anymore. My hand kinda mushed down on his shoulder too. Immediately evacuated and called the police. Turns out he had been dead 3-ish weeks, and if I had checked on him before I left the morning of my vacation, he might not have died. Awful. I had COVID the months to this previously and never got my sense of smell back. Even today I still can't smell. So I didn't smell him. The cold temps kept bugs from populating on him too, so I didn't get any warning of it. I was so shook up over it I didn't do much more than eat, sleep, and work for a couple weeks. Story 13. My boyfriend was a Marine veteran who served in Afghanistan. I went to go pick up lunch because he hadn't eaten all day and just said goodbye to his Nana who was on life support in the hospital. I asked him to come with me. He said he'd rather be alone. I figured he didn't want me to see him grieving, but that he'd put coffee on for us. I got back to his house, smelled the coffee, called his name, then saw that the dog was sitting in the hallway, ears pinned back and wouldn't move. I looked in the living room and found him on the floor. I thought he was napping. The brain is a hell of a thing. He sometimes slept on the floor, so instead of noticing the gore, my brain told me he was napping. I told him to get up. Lunch was here. He didn't move or respond. I went closer and noticed his body was in a weird position to be comfortable for sleeping. I ran over, saw blood coming from his nose, his eyes wide open and stained yellow. Then I realized I was inches from kneeling in his brain matter and shattered skull. He told me his gun was locked up, told his dad he didn't even have his gun at the house. Fucked me up forever, and I'll never stop regretting leaving him alone. End veteran suicide. Rest in sweetest peace, my Joe. Story 14. Was laying in bed watching TV with my GF at the time, and her dad had moved in with us recently. Heard the loudest snoring ever coming out of his room real early, and we almost went to check on him, but figured he just had a long night and was exhausted. Got up, went throughout the day, breakfast chores, all the Saturday morning stuff we'd do. 2 p.m. rolls around and he still hasn't come out of his room. Had a bad feeling, so I kicked the door in and found him sitting there in his underwear, pale bluish-white eyes and mouth open. Apparently he'd gone out with some friends, and they gave him some dope, which turned out to be mostly fentanyl. The snoring we heard was a death rattle, and he was already dead before we even went to sleep. Story 15. I was at a hotel party where a friend was asleep. Everyone else was up and partying, but this guy was just sleeping on the bed. He was also doing this insane snoring, like loud and scary. I told people we need to call 911, but a bunch of them were resisting because they didn't want to get in trouble. Finally, a guy called EMS got there and had him on a heart monitor. He barely had a pulse. We were at a casino hotel, so we all had to go to a holding cell in there as we're all questioned. While in the holding cell, we were told he had passed away at the hospital. He was 18. He had taken a large methadone pill and drank a bunch of alcohol. Story 16. In 1999, I woke up and said good morning to my wife and asked if she wanted a coffee. She did not respond. I went to the kitchen, had breakfast and a coffee. I was getting ready to go to the store as we needed some provisions, and I went to tell my wife that I would be back in 45 minutes. As I walked through our front door, it dawned on me that she had never slept through me saying anything to her, ever. I went back to our bedroom and touched her arm, and it was ice cold. As she was on her side, I rolled her over, and the side of her face that was on her pillow was black, blue, and red. This was a result of the blood pooling. I called 911, and they advised me to give her mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. I argued that this was unnecessary as she was quite obviously dead. The 911 operator convinced me otherwise, and I started to give her mouth-to-mouth. I tasted death as it was the worst tasting event of my life. I knew then that my beautiful wife was dead, and life as I knew it would be forever changed for the worst. The coroner told me that she died from an abscessed tooth that broke and entered her bloodstream. She had died about 6 hours earlier, and I never noticed. Story 17. I was an apartment manager at a complex that were technically condos, but the guy that developed them had owned a majority for like 20 years. There was this older lady that owned her own unit, and we all knew she was a little off and kept to herself, but we all went out of our way to check on her and see if she needed anything. It was winter time, so the hallways were much cooler than normal. We hadn't seen her for several days, and there was a slight smell starting in the hallway. I knew what it was, so I called the police and they came out with the fire department. No one would go in, so it was up to me and my boss to open the window and go in. No one knew of any relatives or anything, so I dug through some of her belongings after they took her out, and after a couple days found an old photo with a couple names on it. I was the one that tracked her daughter down and broke the news to her. She hadn't seen her mom for over 20 years, and the mom she knew was seriously mentally ill. I was able to share what I knew about how she seemed happy, would let people help her some, and everyone kind of looked out for her. Her daughter said that she remembered her mom keeping all the appliances unplugged because they would talk to her otherwise. All the appliances were unplugged. So despite the poor old lady having some mental issues, she ended up finding some peace in the world living in that unit. It really brought her family a sense of peace also. Story 18. I've found 3. Twice was with my son. The first one we were exploring the woods down by Percy Priest Lake, and to summarize, I stepped on some marshy leaves that felt different from the others we had been walking on. I was intrigued and realized it was a leg. Guy had been covered in mud and leaves for several days. News was he was swimming and went missing. Another, we were walking down the sidewalk in an adjacent neighborhood, and an older black male was standing there in front of a house on the sidewalk acting nervous. He said, "Hey man, I think he's dead," and he pointed at an elderly man lying face down in his yard near his driveway. Whole big emotional drama unfolded before the ambulance arrived. The man's wife was inside, and her husband had left to run an errand, and had an aneurysm and died on the way to his car. The last was a blonde girl completely naked behind a sushi restaurant in Nashville near Murfreesboro Pike and Thompson Lane. I called the cops. They and an ambulance arrived. They were there all of 10 minutes. Nothing like you see on TV. They didn't even seem interested in looking for evidence or bothering to find who killed, probably raped and dumped her there. Story 19. Worked in an apartment complex of around 100 units. We had warned all the tenants we would be lubricating the locks and taking the time to fix or change some, as well as other maintenance stuff for the door and hinges. I was on my last floor. I was dreading one door, as the old man living there liked to chat, and he would have been following me in the corridor for the rest of the floor. Knocked a few times, didn't get an answer. I unlocked the door and announced myself as I tried to get in. I met some resistance. He was an odd guy who used to do the same job back in the 50s and 60s and told me he didn't trust anyone because of things he saw. So I assumed he was sleeping, and he put a chair behind the door. I closed it and went for the other apartments. Time came for his apartment, last one. Knocked again and still no answer. I knew he left once a day around noon for his daily shopping. I unlocked the door, announcing myself again while struggling to open the door. The chair was holding the door pretty well, and I didn't want to damage it, so I pried enough for me to squeeze through. Past the door, it closes behind me, and there was no chair. The guy was dead behind the door. I didn't even check to see if he was hurt. I knew instantly he was gone. Felt like my legs had been swept under me, but I was still standing. I calmly, and I say that as what I think I looked like, I probably wasn't, called the police to explain I had just found someone dead. The operator asked me to do CPR, went through the steps with me, but I couldn't. I knew he was dead and probably had been for almost a day. The operator told me the police were on their way. I moved the guy just enough so I could open the door normally. Some tenant steps out super joyous. What a lovely day, me faking a smile. Went down to wait for the police and showed them where he was. Turns out he died of old age or age-related incident, and there was nothing I could have done even if I was there when it happened. Told me he probably took a shit, got up and died on the spot since he was near the bathroom. I was working alone that day. Boss had left on vacation and I was the only worker for the week. The co-owner of the building arrived by chance about 30 minutes into my questioning by the police. Didn't even think to call him. He took care of the rest. I left, walked a bit, and got myself a juicy burger. I was traumatized for a few weeks until we decided to renovate the place after the legal stuff was over, and I faced my fears by going back inside that apartment. Story 20. Was a dog walker. Picked this girl's dog up 5 days a week and had gotten to know her a bit. One day she asked me to watch her dog for a couple months. It seemed sketchy. It wasn't long after that I opened the door to her place, and there she was, hanging. Fucking sucked. I would frequently carry her dog around singing Landslide by Fleetwood Mac and silently crying in the next few months. Thankfully, a coworker of mine kept the doggo for a few months. That coworker also ended up dying of an OD. I had a really hard time with anxiety and jump scares for quite a while after. I'm 90% sure she hung herself with a slip lead she got from me, so using those daily only reinforced the trauma. Story 21. My mom wasn't answering her phone on Mother's Day. It wasn't abnormal, as she had been like that ever since my dad passed away in May of 2018. This year was the 5-year anniversary of his passing, and on the day would have been 55 years of marriage had he not passed. Her neighbor messaged me saying he couldn't get a hold of her. That's when I knew something was wrong. Her neighbor was close with her and was always there helping her. I think he secretly had a thing for her, as they were both the same age. She always answered him even if she didn't want to be bothered. I drove over there earlier than I was supposed to. She was deaf, so she couldn't talk on the phone, but she would always text. I walked in the house and didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. I walked into the back bedroom of her second-floor master bedroom, and as I started going through the door, I saw her knees on the bed, so I thought she was just sitting there. As I walked a little closer, I saw a gun in her lap. I knew what had happened. I called the police and got out of the house and threw up on the front lawn. I'm a disabled Army vet. I've seen some fucked up things. I have never seen anything like that. It's the worst thing I've ever seen, and I can't unsee it. Every day I wake up and see her laying there. Blood and brain matter all over everything. She had tricked her neighbor into loading the gun for her, so he felt horrible too. It was just all around awful. Story 22. I was working as a computer operator at a sporting good distributor. I was 19 years old, recently graduated from high school, but my girlfriend at the time was 1 year younger, and it was her senior prom night. I had the last shift each day and was responsible for backing up the systems to reel tape and storing them in the fireproof safe upstairs each night. I was changing into my rented tux when the last tape finished, shirt and pants and shoes. I grabbed the tapes and hurried upstairs so I could go pick up my date. I turned the corner and found my boss's boss collapsed on the floor. I learned later that he had died of a blood clot from a broken leg while leaving for the weekend. Other than me, he was the last one in the building on a Friday night. His broken leg was acquired at the company picnic softball game a week or two before. He had a huge full-leg cast and he was a mountain of a man. I imagine he must have had to work quite hard to make it down the tight hallway and down the stairs with that cast. In the constrained hallway, I could not roll him over onto his back. Called 911 and waited for authorities. It was quite sad. His wife and kids came to pick him up after picking up his elderly parents at the airport. The whole family drove into his death scene and learned the news together. The incident made me quite late to my date's prom, for which she was an angry, uncaring bitch. Didn't give a damn that I had just found a dead man, just mad I was late. Thankfully, our relationship ended soon after. Story 24. One of my earlier jobs was a carer at a swanky end-of-life care home. I worked a skeleton crew at night, one person per floor, and was doing my rounds. I was in the room with a nonverbal lady whose life consisted of dribbling, twitching, and occasionally moaning. Couldn't communicate in any way, and she didn't have any family. I entered the room and saw she was awake. I said a few generic kind words and let her know what was happening as more of a courtesy than anything. I turned round to prep some personal care when I heard a weird exhale. Turned round and she was still in an unusual way. I wandered over and it took a second to register. Called the nurse who arrived 2 minutes later and yep, they had died. I began prepping the body for collection as the family was notified and that was that. Found a few others dead over the months I was there, but that was the only one I was ever in the room with. Story 25. Not me, but my mum. She was out walking the dog and was down a long tree-lined single-track road when the dog, a large German shepherd called Selin, froze, hackles up, growling. Around 50, maybe 60 yards ahead, hanging from a tree branch, was a man in a brown coat. It was at this point started to panic a bit. Should she check to see if they were dead? She didn't have anything on her to cut them down with. Should she go and get help? This was pre-mobile phone, so she would have to leave and find a house or pay phone. Finally plucking up the courage, she approached the body, dog still freaking out, only to find it wasn't a dead body at all. It was a Tasmanian devil helium balloon stuck on a branch. She got glasses shortly after that. The funniest part of this story is that my mom is a forensic anthropologist and worked for the coroner's office at the time. She was around dead bodies almost every day, but faced with one out in the wild, so to speak, she panicked. Story 26. I was a caregiver for a few months, and during that time I primarily took care of a man in his 60s who had dementia after suffering a stroke. This guy could barely speak and had no idea what year it was, and as a result couldn't really communicate what he was feeling. He had a sister who lived him, but basically did nothing for him besides take his disability money. I started noticing something strange a few days before it happened. He was weirdly quiet and wasn't having BMs. One night I put him to bed at the end of my shift at 8 p.m. and drove home. I remember it was pissing rain and I was listening to Riders on the Storm, LOL, and I felt like something bad was going to happen. The next morning I came into my shift at 9 a.m. and my client's sister was on her way out to run errands or something, and I came inside and started to get my client's meds ready and clocked in. I then walked over to my client's room and opened the door. The first thing I noticed was a sweet fragrance, and I saw my client in the dark with his hand up in the air like he was grabbing something. I figured he had finally had a BM at night, and I would have to clean it up. So I walked over to him and noticed he was completely still and had vomit all over his chest, and his mouth was agape with his eyes open. I reached over to his hand, and to my horror, it was unbelievably cold. Any of you who have felt a dead body know what I mean. It just feels so fucking wrong to the touch. So I called 911, I told them what happened, meanwhile I'm sobbing, and just fully having a mental breakdown. The cops come and interview me. They asked the sister the last time she had checked on him. She told them that she saw him last night when I was putting him to bed at 8 p.m. She had not checked on him at all that night. For 13 hours he was in bed without anyone checking in on him. The autopsy said he had a massive heart attack that night, and based on how cold he was, I'm guessing he had died shortly after I left. Shit haunts me to this day. Story 27. I typically like to enjoy my cup of coffee early in the morning while I skate around the park near me. On the day after Halloween, I went through my normal routine but come across a body hanging in a tree. At first, I thought it was a very realistic decoration prank, but as I got closer, it was clearly a dead body. He had left his bike and a backpack next to the tree stump. I did not feel the need to go through his belongings. I kind of froze up for a second there until a jogger came by and her reaction snapped me back into reality. We called emergency services and they came shortly after and cleaned up. When I told my friends and boss what happened, it took them a while to believe my story, since they all thought it was a leftover Halloween decoration. I don't know why the 911 call wasn't convincing enough. I kept looking on the internet to find an obituary or an article related to the situation for proof, but nothing came out as far as I could tell. Story 28. When I was 12, my dad and I were driving down a logging road to a lake to go fishing. I looked out my window and saw what I thought was someone laying in the ditch. It took some convincing, but my dad turned around and we went back. He pulled over and we got out to check it out. There was a man laying in the ditch unresponsive and wasn't breathing. We flagged down another vehicle and sent them back to the highway so they can get to a house and call the police. Turned out, the guy was from a group of people that were camping. He had got drunk and wandered off. They determined he passed out in the ditch and had vomited in his sleep and choked on it. Story 29. In my hometown in 2011, there was a big story about a guy that the police were chasing who went missing during the chase. The family were trying to say it was some kind of police killing and cover-up. It was a big deal. This happened in early spring when the snow was melting and the river was really high. I used to ride my bike along the river near where he went missing every day, and this time of year the river would always flood and block my normal path through the park, so I would have to ride in the street for a few weeks. Well, after said few weeks, the river dropped back below flood level and the bike path was accessible again, so I rode it, and a few minutes in I was a weird log floating along that wasn't usually there. I got closer, and yeah, not a log. It was the dude's dead body, and I instantly connected the dots and realized what happened. He jumped out of his car and took off on foot into what he thought was a forest on the other side of the river from where I found him, except it's only a forest for about 10 feet. Then it's a very steep 75-foot or so bank down into the river that was super high, fast, and cold at the time. He went running full speed into that tree line, fell off the cliff, got knocked out and stuck in the branches at the bottom and drowned. And then a few weeks later, when the water level dropped enough, he popped out and floated downstream, and I found him maybe 20 minutes later. I also once in the mod 90s found a guy that had hung himself in some woods near my house, and the cop that interviewed me afterwards was then murdered by a kid I was in middle school with a few weeks later. We were 7th graders at the time, I think. Story 30. I worked at a restaurant next to a train track. You had to pass over the tracks to get to our restaurant. A train was stopped and blocking the intersection. My manager asked if I could cross the tracks, literally climb through a train slot, mind you, to find out what was going on. After I get on the other side of the tracks, I see police cars and ambulances. The whole shebang. I walked to the scene because I'm curious and wanted to get the full story. I wish I had not. There was a man who unalived himself by sticking his head on the tracks as the train came. I saw a decapitated body. I ran back so fast. I told my manager and he closed the restaurant for the day. We found out later that the family on the other side of the tracks was in their yard screaming at him to get up. Traumatizing. This was 6 or 7 years ago, but I still see the image clear as day. Story 31. I would not exactly say I found it like it was laying in the woods or something. I was working as an overnight doorman, security at a bad apartment complex. In the middle of the night, a naked woman went off the 9th floor balcony. I was the first one there. She was laying on the ground where the concrete walkway meets some grass with legs broken in several places. Her torso was basically mush inside. She took a few shallow agonal breaths and I watched her die. Her boyfriend and her were into bondage, S&M. He says he woke up to find that she had hung herself from the balcony with a bedsheet tied to the leg of a couch. He got a butcher knife and cut the sheet to save her, but she fell. She had the corner of a bedsheet tied in a loose half-hitch around her neck. The police arrived and took statements, and then I went to lunch. I had a drained can of Progresso chicken noodle soup over rice that I microwaved. It was pretty salty, but quick to make. Then I finished the remaining few hours of my shift. Story 32. Not me, but my mom unfortunately found her mom several years ago. My mom had been trying to call her all day, but hadn't been able to get through. She got a horrible feeling in the pit of her stomach. Despite this having happened before, my Nana would forget to charge her phone occasionally, and race to the senior apartment she lived at. It was Sunday evening and my mom saw the paper by the door. That was when she really knew. She threw the door open and injured her hand in the process. She went to my Nana's room. I just saw her foot peeking out from behind the bed. She instantly knew she was dead, as the foot didn't look right at all. Apparently someone else had to call 911 as my mom, a former nurse, could only scream, "She's dead, she's dead." We got a small bit of comfort when the medics told my mom that my Nana hadn't died from the fall, but instead fell because she suddenly died. We were relieved she hadn't had to lie there. My mom likes to say, her spirit soared before she hit the floor. Story 33. I was working at a gas station. Wasn't a really great part of town, but not as bad as other parts. Anyway, there was this old dirty couple that lived in the apartment building nearby. They would come up and whenever they bought shit would always try to get a free fountain soda or something that we would just throw away, their words, if it went unsold. Fast forward about a year or so, I'm going into the morning shift at like 6 a.m., taking all the trash from pumps from overnight to the dumpster, and bam! Someone threw the lady's dead body in the dumpster. I called the cops because I just found a dead body at work. Cops show up and do whatever it is they do after they're done, asking the gas clerk WTF happened. The lady and her husband or whatever were selling heroin/fentanyl and they got murdered. The other dude's dead body was found in another gas station dumpster across town. Story 34. I was 19 and in college. The time before getting out of bed, I had zero energy to go to school, but at the last minute I decided to finally go. I passed by my grandparents' room as I always say good morning to them before anything else. I knocked and opened the door, found my grandma and granddad sleeping on the bed. Weird, my grandpa has never slept on the bed for the longest time. Breathing problems. I told myself, okay, I will let them sleep longer. Before closing their door, I caught a glimpse of my granddad's feet. They were bluish gray. I remember panicking. I tried to turn him to his side, woke my confused grandma up. He was already starting to get stiff. His face was contorted. I tried to calm my grandma down. We both cry-screamed. Members of the family heard us. They found us in the room, bawling our eyes out, hugging. It was a mess of a day. I loved my grandpa so much. He had the kindest heart and the most hilarious jokes. Story 35. I work in a pretty remote place, steep hills on the road leading to it. One morning a few years back, a colleague of mine noticed something odd on the hillside opposite our workplace, about 200 m below the road. We were about half a mile away or so. Not easy to tell what it was, but I had a feeling in the pit of my stomach that it might be a car. So we drove over to look, parked up on the road above where we thought it was, and started making our way down the hillside. It was mostly bracken and ferns, and there was a big flattened area about 10 meters in, then another a bit further down with churned up soil and a red wing mirror cover. As we got closer to a breakpoint bank in the hillside, we came across the car sat upright against a fence that was following the bank, and it was really badly damaged front and rear, boot open and folded in half, glass and contents of the car everywhere. Just as I made my way towards the right-hand side of it, my colleague put his hand on my shoulder and stopped me. He said, "Shit, there's a girl there." And just under the open driver's side door was a girl lying on her back with her mouth wide open. She was really badly bruised and discolored. We didn't go over to her. We could tell she had passed away, so we straight away called emergency services and shouted in case anyone else was around, and I checked the passenger side of the car. She had been driving alone and must have driven off the road by accident in the fog we'd had the night before. Police said she didn't die immediately during the accident, as she had got out of the car with the keys in her hand. It was very horrible to find her, knowing that she'd been through such a horrible accident and still been conscious briefly afterwards. Story 36. I worked for a company with my dad that did mold remediation and also crime scene cleanup. We had chemicals that got rid of any kind of stink you can imagine, while my dad and I got sent to an apartment complex for a weird smell that was radiating from a building off on its own. Landlord thought maybe a cat or rat had gotten stuck under the foundation. My dad goes in first and takes 2 steps in and then stops me with a hand to my shoulder. Tells me to wait and then goes further in. Me being the 18-year-old I was, I didn't wait and eventually followed. Rather wish I'd had listened. There in his bed was an old man that had passed months earlier. The level of humidity in the apartment and the fact that no one had bothered to check on him meant he was well into decomposing and looked like he was melting into the bed. Needless to say, I had some messed up dreams for a while after that. Story 37. I was a case manager. Went to pick up a client for her doctor's appointment. She was very slow, intellectually. She asked to stop at her neighbor's apartment to drop off a cup of coffee, and I said sure. She had a key to her neighbor's apartment because they were good friends. When we got to the door, she told me she'd been bringing her neighbor coffee for 3 days, but she hadn't woken up yet to drink it. My stomach dropped. She said this literally as she was opening the door, and I knew what I was about to see. Sure enough, the neighbor was laying on a mattress on the floor, arms over her head, surrounded by untouched cups of coffee, and very clearly dead. I had to take my client back out and explain the situation to her. She was genuinely shocked. The police came and found a broken window in her apartment, so then I was worried that my client had been going in and out of a murder scene. But it turned out the woman had died of complications of diabetes, aka was out of insulin and couldn't afford more. I didn't stay a case manager for long after that. Story 38. That's not my story, but I got the permission to tell it. Basically, my friend went on a date with a guy she had previously gone on a few dates with. They were walking through the center of the city and went on a bridge. Immediately noticed something in the water. Yep, it was a body of some man and it was totally bloated at that point. Apparently her date had the experience with this type of situations and called the police right away. And when the police finally arrived, they initially wanted to bring them both in for questioning, but thankfully the guy insisted on not involving my friend into that. Later on, the Coast Guard had to be involved to get the body out of water. The body looked awful as expected, considering it had allegedly been in the water for at least a week. From what the coroners concluded, it appeared that the man was aged from 25 to 40, which didn't match any missing persons reports. The man was only wearing some plain t-shirt and shorts, no shoes, no socks, no jacket, and I mind you it was October. The only notable thing was his backpack, perfectly sealed, that only had a red dress inside. Again, no personal identification documents were found. There was no news coverage about it. Nobody reached out to my friend's, now ex-boyfriend, and it's been a few years now. Story 39. I was the closing manager at a bar. After dinner rush, 10 p.m., a staff member said someone's drunk and passed out in the men's bathroom stall. I crawled under the stall, and as soon as I saw, I knew he wasn't alive. He was blue and slumped against the wall. At this point, I've unlocked the stall door, and my GM and the staff member are on the phone with 911 and we begin CPR. Firefighters came and took him away on the stretcher. Pronounced dead on the scene. The kid was 25. He met his dealer at the bar and shortly after OD'd on the toilet. His father came by the next day I worked. He knew his son had a drug problem and sincerely thanked us for trying to save his son's life. That conversation with his father was one of the most surreal experiences of my life, and I'll never forget it. Story 40. First was my granddad's, who had died in his back garden. That was horrible. I had to call my aunt and tell her over the phone. Her cries still haunt me to this day, 20-plus fires down the line, but we are still very close. We take comfort that he passed in his beloved garden. The second was a few years later, and I was picking up a spare part or something for a mate's car from a garage in Newport. I was sitting in the waiting area and looked up at the footpath, where I saw what looked to be an old lady leaning back, examining a tire on her mobility scooter. There was a dog on a lead sat next to her. A few minutes later, and she was still there, still looking at this tire. A few more minutes passed, and there was no movement, so I thought maybe she needed a bit of help. I went outside, walked up the grassy bank to the footpath, shouted hello a few times as I walked towards her, but when I saw she was just motionless, started running. Ran 999, did what they asked and checked for a pulse, and then waited for the ambulance and police to rock up. I can still remember how her skin felt as I checked for a pulse. Kinda like room temperature raw meat, maybe a sinewy chicken leg with the skin on. Story 41. I was in the Marines back in the early 2010 odds, and the last of the 4 years was in Pendleton. I'd met a girl who went to college up in Isla Vista and went to see her almost every weekend. 6-8 HR drive depending on traffic since it was always bad, but sometimes very bad. Elliot Roger went on a killing spree on my birthday, May 23rd back in 2014, and my GF and I were walking to get pizza as a treat that night. We heard what we thought were close fireworks, and then saw his BMW screeching around the block where her place was behind us. We had to pass a sorority house on the way and saw 2 dead sorority girls on the grass, recently shot. His night ended shortly after hitting a bicyclist and offing himself in his car 1 block from her place. I remember the group of bystanders beginning to swarm those girls to see if they could help, as we tried figuring out just what the hell was going on. If we had left maybe 10 minutes prior, we would have been on that same sidewalk around the time he shot them and likely been victims of his incel fury ourselves. Another incident around the same time with the same girl was when I decided to take a train back to base instead of driving, seeing as she'd picked me up near Oceanside on that Friday. An hour passed on the train and it abruptly came to a halt. Come to find someone had thrown themselves under the tracks and there was some debris from the impact on my side of the car that I unfortunately got to sit there and watch be cleaned up over the 2 hours we were stopped. Story 42. Some backstory. When I was a teen, I struggled with my depression. Hard. Tried to kill myself, but chickened out at the last minute. One of my online friends was an absolute gem, called me every day, listened to my problems, and really turned everything around for me. My relationship with my sister wasn't great. She filled that void and more. Fast forward to college. We still talked regularly, but I got a lot busier. Her family situation was fucked, leading to relationships that were abusive, and her mental health was tanking. I still tried helping her, but I couldn't give her the time and effort she gave me. Well, one night she sends me a really strange wall of text, telling me how happy she is for me, hopes that I achieve my dreams, and how she's sad she's not going to see it. All alarms are firing. I respond and am met with silence. So, I stole my parents' car and drove 11 hours through the night to her apartment, getting there around 4 or 5 and having to break in and find her. She's cut herself many times, there's blood drippings everywhere, and she finished it with a hanging. Now I'm riddled with guilt because I wasn't there as much as she was for me, and even in her darkest hour was still a ray of sunshine and love. I now have nightmares of seeing her regularly, especially when someone else reaches out to me for help. Even when they're being manipulative, I can't help but throw myself at their problems because I'm trying to make it up. No, I shouldn't blame myself, but I do. Story 43. Walked in on the aftermath of a shotgun-inflicted suicide. Guy had been a dear friend for a while, but he just hadn't been the same since his girlfriend left him. The girlfriend made up lies about him being abusive, and that's why she left, so everyone dogged on him and nobody wanted to believe him. In reality, she was using him for money the whole time. Once he found out and confronted her, she left him and made up her lies. He just didn't show up for work one day. That wasn't like him. I told the manager I'd check by his place during lunch. I went by. Front door was locked. I knew that he never locked the back door because he'd lock himself out sometimes, so he left that one unlocked during the day just in case. Walked into the living room. He was there. Everything above his jaw was gone. The shotgun was still in his hands. His poor dog was sat there whimpering, probably wondering why her owner wasn't moving or talking or anything. She looked terrified. I found the note. He died angry. He died angry, scared, and alone. Most of his friends left when his ex-girlfriend made up those lies. Me and 2 others remained because we believed him. His note made it obvious that he was angry with those who had turned their backs on him. One line even said that he hoped that his ex would be the one to find him. However, later in the note, he did seem to calm down. There were apologies to his parents and his family, and the friends that stuck with him through it all. Called the police. They show up and take my statement. They pen off the area and I take the dog. I still have her. Story 44. I was getting dressed for work around 3 a.m. My fiancée was still asleep in the bed. I always give her a kiss before I leave for work, and it usually wakes her up. For some reason, something felt off. I'm not sure why I felt this way. Shrugged it off as being 3 a.m. drowsies, grabbed my keys and stopped by the bassinet to see our 3-month-old son off as well. He was ice cold, and I could see he looked pale through the pitch black. Turned on the light and oh my God. He was yellow, blue, and purple, not breathing. I called 911 and the instructed CPR, but it was pretty clear visually that it wasn't going to help. I did it anyways. The taste of your 3-month-old baby's dead breath and the little sighs that were coming back from the rescue breaths still haunt me. My fiancé and family were so torn that I had to step up to make all of the arrangements for him. It was tough. I had to be strong when everyone around me couldn't. I didn't cry at the funeral because I wanted to remain stoic and help everyone else get through it, soon to realize that even years later it would be thrown in my face that I didn't love my child or care about him at all because I didn't even cry at his funeral. Story 45. Didn't find it, but the person had just been killed. I was leaving for the gym about 5 a.m. It was still dark out, but the outside of my house was lit up red with flashing lights. Turns out the man that lived besides my neighbors had been ambushed and shot. Crazy thing is, I do remember hearing gunshots around 4:30 a.m., but my neighborhood isn't the best, so it didn't faze me, even though they sounded close. So I drove past. It was so early, I'm half asleep, lights flashing, but I do remember seeing him laying there on the ground. They hadn't even covered him yet. His Jordans, he seemed so close to the front door, like he almost made it home. Poor man, someone stole his car. I cried at the gym from the shock. I always imagined the people around me like, wow, this girl must really not want to work out. Rip neighbor. I also saw a dead person at the corner of my street where I work. The cops also hadn't covered him, but he was sitting up against a tree at the bus stop. You could tell he had been dead for a few hours. I was waiting in the median to turn onto my block, looking over at the cops like, why are they all standing around the tree like that? And then I realized there was a person sitting there not moving. Story 46. My daughter struggled with anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation since she hit puberty. We did everything we could to get her help. Therapy, counseling, long talks, even checked her into a program for 3 months after her first attempt. I never truly grasped or understood the level to which she struggled. About 4 months ago, I woke up like usual, knock on her door to tell her to take the dogs out and make sure she took her meds. I didn't open the door more than a crack to give her privacy. Then I went about my morning as usual. About 30 minutes later, my wife asked our son to tell her to take the dogs out again, and he came to me a little panicky saying that she looked weird. My initial thought is she was still sleeping or something. When I first opened the door, my mind couldn't make it out, but I put myself between my son and the scene. I thought she was just messing about until it sunk in that she had hung herself from her bed. I went to check her pulse, but her wrists were ice cold and her body was pale white. My wife was about to leave for the store, so I went downstairs to stop her. The next 20 minutes were frantic, but we were far too late. When we went back into the room and called 911, I had to cut her down, and the immensity of her body falling onto me just crushed my spirit. I had seen a dead body before. My grandfather passed away from cancer when I was about 12, but this was different. It was so much worse. It's the worst kind of pain I've ever experienced. I felt simultaneously like a part of my soul escaped my body while also being incredibly numb. The entire process of the police arriving, the medical examiner arriving, then carting her out, us explaining to our 2 other children that their sister was gone. It's too much even for me now. Most days I'm just too busy to think about it, but when the house is quiet and I lay down to go to sleep or when I wake up and sit in the shower, that scene is there. Those feelings of helplessness and fear are as ripe as the day I found her. Story 47. I worked for a nonprofit that provided affordable housing for senior citizens that could live independently. Occasionally, we had to do wellness checks if we hadn't seen a resident for a while, or if a friend family asked us to. I ended up finding 2 bodies in my 3 years there. The first was a lady in her 70s who was a bit of a character, bipolar but normally pleasant with us on the staff. She'd had a heart attack on the toilet. I found her crumpled forward with her pants down and her head lying at an odd angle against the bathtub. We never found her cat. The second was a very nice gentleman, formerly homeless, who was a bit of a recluse. In my 3 years, I never saw him outside of his apartment. I'm not even sure how he got groceries. One of his friends on the property hadn't seen him for a couple of weeks and he wouldn't open his door, so I keyed in to check on him. He had passed peacefully in his sleep on his bed, lying on his side. It had been 2 weeks though, so he had begun to dissolve into his mattress. We had to get the bio cleanup company out there. I didn't feel too personally affected by finding these people, but my employer was generous and always let us take time off if we'd found anyone, so I would usually just take the rest of the day off to relax and spend some time in prayer for them and their families. Story 48. This story still fucks me up. I had a buddy, let's call him Joe, whose mom and older brother got killed during a car accident, so he was very depressed and he lived with his dad from that point on. His dad had serious health problems, and one day he had died from a heart attack. Joe was barely keeping it together, so me and a few other friends deciding that I should let him live with me. I kept all my guns, knives, and anything that he could harm himself with out of his reach in a safe. After a while of him living with me, he seemed to be showing major improvement, so I left him home alone and I went to grab groceries. After maybe an hour or 2, I got a call from another friend telling me that he had got sent a very sketchy text from Joe. I drove as fast as I could, I just couldn't make it. I found Joe's body slumped on his bed with cut wrists. I took him to the hospital, but it was too late. He was only 17, and to this day I still don't know where he found a fucking knife. Story 49. My senior year of high school, our furnace was on the fritz in the winter. My dad would go in and light the pilot as a sort of routine to keep the house heated. As a lazy teenager, I didn't have initiative for much of anything, and never messed with it myself. My siblings sometimes did, and might have accidentally broke a piece to the furnace trying to relight it and been too scared of punishment to say anything. Anyway, my dad came down one morning while we were the only ones there, and I was downstairs playing Rock Band. I said mornin', Dad grunted with a nod, walked by me toward the back room with the furnace, and not long after I looked back at the screen there was this god-awful blast. I turned to see the fridge thrown into the kitchen table, furniture scattered, clothes scattered, and I got up and rushed back to call out for my dad. I saw the smoke, I saw stuff, scattered, and I didn't know why, but I couldn't see my dad. I couldn't figure out anything. It was like going into that room immediately disconnected any ability I had to process what was going on, or what I was actually seeing. I guess I'm grateful for that, but I withdrew to the other rooms when the smoke spread and called 911. It took me a little bit, and the first responder, locals knew my family, calling my dad's name, at first seeking, then calling too, then shrieking it so loud the memory still haunts me. That scream hit me with the reality of the situation, and everything snapped into place. I was covering my ears to try shutting everything out, but I just kept hearing that woman scream and I couldn't help but sob hysterically. Based on what I have been told, I had to have seen my father's body. I had to see it mangled by shrapnel, but I've never pieced it together in my head. What I remember was scattered clothes and things that my memory doesn't piece together as anything tangible, like censored reds and whites, and I'm grateful for that. I worry it might have cost my dad a single moment of goodbye if there ever was one, but also just glad I don't have to actually live with what the scene of his death looked like. Story 50. Once when I used to repo cars, I was at an apartment complex waiting for a tow truck because somebody had wanted to surrender their car. I was just standing in an empty parking lot with nobody around when I noticed this very attractive woman wandering around like she was looking for something. She was calling a name that I do not remember, but I do remember thinking it was a dog that got out of the house. Then I heard her screaming, and she ran out of her apartment and was waving to me to come over. I hate getting involved in shit, but she was in a panic and nobody else was around. So I went over and she ushered me into her apartment, and in the back bedroom, her husband had hung himself with a rope from the clothes hanger. So she was there screaming and his little boy was screaming. I told her to find a knife so we can cut him down, and I held up his body trying to create slack in the rope until she got back with the knife. I called 911 and we laid him on the floor. They wanted me to do CPR on him, but I said no and told the wife to do it. Anyway, the paramedics and cops showed up and took him away, but he was already dead. She wanted me to reassure her that he would be okay, but I did not want to lie, so I did not say anything. I went back outside and my tow truck came to haul away the car. I gave a statement to the police and then I went home and drank myself to sleep. I still think of her and that poor little traumatized boy. This man should have killed himself far away from where his family can find him.